How are you?
I am exhausted. I'm sure I'm not the only zombie today after staying up way too late watching the baseball game last night. But I will state for the record, I am not a Cubs fan. So if you guys want to log out now, I would not be offended. What we're going to talk about today is advanced genealogy topics. So we're going to dig a little deeper into the types of records that exist. Okay, sorry. I'm having technical difficulties because it's early for me. So how many of you, in just the chat box, how many of you sat in on the webinar 2 weeks ago? And Louise will give you a minute to
yeah, if you just type yes or no in the questions box, I'll say that. And in a moment, I will put a link to that recording in case people missed it.
It was a very basic, some hopefully didn't feel that it was too basic, overview of where to get started when you're talking about genealogy with patrons coming into your library. So I covered 3 main topics. We talked about vital records, newspapers, and censuses. Those are the kind of things that you can find online. What I'm going to talk about today are going to be the types of things that aren't necessarily online. You can do your preliminary research and you can guide people to start online, but these are the resources and the types of materials that are going to have to be viewed kind of boots on the ground in the area where your patron is doing their research. So I have to start with a joke, just simply because after sitting through 5 hours and 4 minutes of baseball, I was a little punch drunk. So if any of you have seen the movie Airplane, you're going to see a couple of airplane references throughout the presentation today. But it's one of those moments where, oh my goodness, the internet is down, what do I do? And we have to resort back to paper, newspapers, and microfilm, or just the records that aren't actually online to begin with. So those are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today. So things that you're going to find at your local courthouse, that you can find at colleges and universities across the state. I'm going to talk about the state archive system, and I'm going to talk briefly about the federal archive system and the types of materials that are available to you through there. And then I'm going to talk about the types of things that you can find at historical and genealogical societies. I talked a couple weeks ago about what you can find in your libraries, and we discussed things that you already have within your collections. So this is really moving outside of public libraries and outside of your building to get them on the right track using original resources at these locations. So courthouses are probably the most well-known resource when you're talking about to genealogists about their family history, but there are so many types of courthouse records that you might not be aware of, or that your patrons might not realize can be beneficial to them when they're doing their genealogy research. So things that you can access at a typical courthouse would be things like adoptions and guardianship records. Guardianship records aren't just for those children who are orphaned. The guardianships actually apply to adults as well for a number of reasons. It could be because they are feeble-minded. It can be because they have a disability. I have some cases where guardianship was issued to the wife because her husband was a habitual drunk. So you find guardianships for all kinds of crazy reasons, not just minor children who need to be watched. Other things that you can find at the courthouse are criminal court records. We all have a tendency to think that all of our ancestors are upstanding citizens who never got in trouble for anything. But criminal court records include a wide range of crimes. Things like your obvious criminal court activities, burglary, murder, homicide, rape, to other things that we don't necessarily think of in the 21st century, things like poverty. You'll find a lot of records detailing foreclosures and forfeitures of property that fall under criminal court because they're being prosecuted by the people who are owed money, whether that's their landlord, whether that's the local grocer or doctor. So those fall under criminal court sometimes. You also have things like bastardy cases where it's usually 90% of the time the young lady's father who's pressing charges against the suspected father. So you can find some really interesting criminal court records as well. Family court or small claims court, those are the type of records that deal with messy family issues. You see probates and wills down at the bottom. So let's say dad dies and leaves all of his property to his eldest son, which is pretty standard, and then the second child gets all of the personal property, like the household goods and the animals and maybe a little bit of cash, and then the youngest daughter gets left out. You know, she gets $1 left to her in the will. That might be because she married a man that dad didn't like, or it can be because she felt that, she didn't do her, household duties for whatever reason. Then the youngest child sues the estate, and they're looking for their share of the pie. You find those in family court, and if family court is a late construct in some counties, then they fall under either chancery court or small claims court. So those types of records can really be beneficial to a genealogist who is trying to figure out why the youngest child left home and went west, because they might have been left out of the estate. Incorporations and tax records are a great resource as well. Just like in the 21st century, we pay our taxes every August, just like they did in the 19th, 20th, 18th centuries. So you can find these tax records available sometimes through the local courthouse. We have a tendency to think that the courthouse only has, land records and deeds and things like that. They're very common and they're easy to come by when you're at the courthouse. The Recorder of Deeds office is usually where you're going to go to find these types of property records. But another important avenue of research are mortgages. In the 20th and 21st centuries, we buy a house, we take out a mortgage. Those two things kind of go hand in hand. But historically, you could buy property, you could buy a deed to a piece of property without ever having to owe money on it. You could buy it outright. Mortgages were typically reserved for people who were renters to farms or buildings in town. So if you have a patron who's researching their ancestor and he was a tenant farmer, he never actually owned the property that he was farming, you're not going to go to a deed book. You're not going to look for a land record as the owner. You're going to look through the mortgages, the individual mortgage books, and look for that rent that that tenant farmer was paying to the landlord of the property. So there are a set of records that don't often get used as much as they should, but they're really, really useful when you're doing research. And the best tip, the best piece of advice that you can give to a patron who's doing research for tenant farmers is if you're looking at a property record, at the top, if they are renting, if it is a mortgage, it'll say indenture instead of deed. So it's an important piece to keep in mind when somebody's looking for those types of records. The county courthouse is rife with maps and plats of all kinds. They can be road maps, they can be subdivision survey plats, they can be cemetery maps, they can be all kinds of maps that the county keeps on file that are registered as either a business is incorporated or as a new subdivision is being laid out to be sold. So the county is a great resource to go to look for maps of all ages, whether it's the incorporation, the initial incorporation of a town in the 1830s, or whether or not it's the GIS overlay for your local town showing the water mains in the 21st century. So they have a lot of really useful maps and plats available. Another resource is naturalizations. So I mentioned a little bit in the last presentation about citizenship and naturalization records. And the county courthouse would be a very good place to start when you're looking for those types of records. So for example, there were 3 different types of courts that you could naturalize in if you wanted to become an American citizen. So before 1920, you could either go to the county court where you lived, or you could go to the city court depending on the size of the community you lived in. So you could go to Cook County, or you could go to the city of Chicago. So you could go to Jackson County, or you can go to the Kansas City courthouse. So there were different places where you could go. After 1920, everything became federalized, so everything goes through the U.S. District Court now. So if you have any question about whether or not what court they might have used, start with your local county courthouse and see if they have a naturalization index that's available to you to check for the surname. Probates and wills are pretty standard. A will is the deceased files with the county courthouse before they die. When they pass away, then there's an executor who's put in charge of the estate. If somebody dies intestate and they do not have an executor, they do not have a will that they created in advance, then that goes through what's called probate. And when you're looking at probate records, there are 2 terms to keep in mind. If you're dealing with the executor of an estate, That means that there is a will that was proven before the person died, and there was somebody who was assigned before the decedent passed away. If you see the term administrator, that means that it's somebody who's appointed by the court because there wasn't somebody who was designated ahead of time. So usually people who die in accidents or who die suddenly don't necessarily have a will that's been written. So an administrator is somebody who has the financial ability to cover the costs of settling the estate, paying off the doctor's bills, paying off the rent for the deed on the property, who then is paid back once the estate is settled. As you see on the left there, here's just a very generic naturalization form. Before 1906, it was just a generic form like this that they filled in. So it would be I, state your name, you know, renounce allegiance to, fill in the blank. You don't start to get the really good family details about what ship they arrived on and who their next of kin is until after 1906. So before that time, you're going to get a form that looks pretty identical to this in the state of Illinois. On the right, you see just an index to property owners. A lot of counties have these recorded alphabetically by the property owner. So this is not special to Will County or Kane County or Kendall County. This is something that you would see across the state. So what those little pieces, those little numbers mean are whether or not it's a deed and whether they're buying or selling. Another avenue of research are colleges and universities. Genealogists, especially genealogists who are just starting out, have a tendency to overlook colleges and universities because they think that academia isn't going to have anything that is going to be family specific. And it's absolutely not true. Probably one of the best resources that you can use to your advantage as a public library is the ability to borrow these types of materials through interlibrary loan. So a lot of colleges and universities are research libraries. They are not genealogy libraries. So what that means for us is if I need the city directory from Albany, New York for 1845 and the University of Chicago library has it on the shelf, I can request it and have it sent over. Yes, it's a historic book, but the university isn't interested in genealogy, they're interested in research and history. So they provide these books and make them available as long as they're not part of their special collections or their archives. So things like county histories, whether it's the history of Armentrout, West Virginia, or it's a regional history like the history of the Juniata Valley in Pennsylvania, it doesn't really matter what the subject is, as long as it's a book that they have in their general stacks, then you should have absolutely no problem borrowing those materials. But don't think that it has to just be books either, because a lot of libraries will lend microfilm as well. So you just have to contact the library and find out if it's something that they will circulate. So if there's a newspaper that they have that nobody else seems to have, or it's some other type of directory that they're the only owners, then you can contact them usually and see if they'll lend it, or at the very least, they're more than willing to make copies up to a certain amount in order to provide those for your patrons. So if you're not taking advantage of interlibrary loans through the college and university system, this is really a great way to get that information in your patrons' hands in a fairly timely fashion. Another cool thing about colleges and universities are most of them have either special collections or archives. And what that means is that they're going to collect in a specific area or collect things on a specific topic or geographic location based on their location as well. So, you know, special collections could be anything from just collecting college yearbooks that go along with the history of their university, or it can be map collections. University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana has an absolutely outstanding map collection. University of Chicago also has a really, really strong map collection, and these are worldwide. So not only do they have plat maps and city maps and road maps for their local community, but they also have them on a global scale as well. You also have access to government documents, and I don't just mean the GovDocs that the government printing office puts out quarterly, but government documents relating to their community as well. So if there wasn't a genealogical or historical society in their community, or the courthouse had outgrown its space and they were looking for somebody to take their historic records, a lot of times those would get turned over to the local university or college as well. An example would be Governor State University. Governor State University has the township books for Monee Township in Will County. Even though Governor State isn't even in Will County, it was the closest university to the town of Monee, so that's where they turned over their records. So occasionally you find some things in special collections that aren't where you would expect them to be. Sometimes you'll find in special collections things like funeral home records and local blacksmith shop records and ledgers and receipts, because there wasn't anybody in which they could give those in their community. There wasn't a historical society within their community, and they were historically significant enough that the family or the business, when they closed, wanted to see that they were going to be preserved. So if any of you are familiar with the university system, you've probably heard the term CARLI, Illinois. And what CARLI is, it's the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries. And they have a website. It's where we used to have, it used to be Ilinet, it's where we used to have to borrow materials before SILC, before the state library system. But they also have a digital collection. And even though I know I mentioned that I wasn't going to talk about online resources, I am going to throw a few your way from time to time, just to kind of get you thinking about the types of things that universities or archives or museums might have available to you. So if you go out to CARLI, if you go out to that link that I provided, you can see all of the libraries that participate in this throughout the state of Illinois. And in the upper right-hand corner, it tells you that there are almost 11,000 items that our local universities and colleges have been digitizing across the state and putting them up online and making them available to us free of charge. So I mentioned the Governor State University having taken the Township of Monee's government records and documents. Well, they scanned and digitized all of those and put them online through their digital collection that's available in CARLI. So you find some really neat things in here. If you look on the right-hand side, it kind of breaks down the types of collections they have. So they have things obviously like college yearbooks, but then they also have things like Methodist church records and records on urban transit. So there's some pretty cool things that our colleges have in their special collections. So I'm going to give you an example of a couple. So places like Augustana College has the Swedish Immigration Research Center. So even though Augustana College is out towards the Iowa border, they collect information on Swedish heritage for the entire state of Illinois, as well as for the Midwest as a whole. So if you ever have a patron who comes to you and they say, I'm trying to research my Swedish ancestors, they emigrated and arrived in Chicago, or they arrived in Springfield, or they arrived in Des Moines, then you can send them to Augustana College and they can start doing some research within their special collections. One of my favorites across the state of Illinois is the Circus and Allied Arts Archives at Illinois State University. I went to ISU, and every once in a while I would go up to the top floor of Milner Library and just browse the circus collection that they had. There's some really cool posters and artifacts and things, so you never know. Somebody might say, I have an ancestor who was in Barnum and Bailey Circus back in the day, or the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus. And the university archives has a really cool collection. So it says Circus and Allied Arts. Well, that includes all kinds of things like sideshows and conjurers and all kinds of different things. So it might not have been a circus proper, but it might have been like a circus. So they have some pretty cool stuff there. The University of Chicago, which I also worked at, has the collection of the 1893 World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. Now, there's always been interest in the 1893 World's Fair, but the movie Devil in the White City is going to be coming out next year. So there's been an increased interest in the quote-unquote white city. So the University of Chicago has been digitizing for years their 1893 Columbian Exposition archives, so you can go onto their website and look at some really cool artifacts that they have within their collection. How many of you know of State of Illinois collections, special collections or archives that you use? If you have any, just put them in the chat box, because we would love to hear the types of special collections and archives that you're using around the state. So these last two aren't in Illinois, but I thought they were kind of fun, and like I said, I was getting a little punch drunk late at night. So the Bruce Springsteen Special Collection is at Monmouth College in New Jersey, if any of you are fans of The Boss, or if you're like me and you're a Grateful Dead fan and you're a Deadhead, the University of Santa Clara in California has the Grateful Dead archives. They used to be at Berkeley. I don't know when they moved to UC Santa Clara, but if you're a Grateful Dead fan, then the archives are partially online. They have a bootleg collection that's online, which is absolutely outstanding. So special collections don't always have to be dry, boring government records or university records. There's some pretty cool stuff out there. So I kind of segue into talking about archives by starting with museums. So whether it's a museum like the Field Museum in Chicago or the Adler Planetarium, or whether it's your local historical society in your town, you know, the Jackson County Historical Society, or, you know, the Little White School Museum in Oswego, Illinois, they're going to have family histories, they're going to have family files, they're going to have things like scrapbooks and diaries, photo collections. But what I want you to keep in mind when you're visiting museums and when you're visiting archives, or when you're recommending that patrons go to these places, when you're dealing with archives, they catalog on a completely different level than libraries do. So they'll catalog a collection, and they might put it in a box, or they might put it in a file folder, but they don't index every name in that file or in that box. What they'll do is they'll create a collection description that'll give you the most popular subject headings or titles that you'll see, but they're not going to do what's called an every name index. So if they've got a school yearbook that's part of their collection, they're not going to index every name that's within that yearbook. They're just going to tell you, we have the yearbook for, you know, Illinois State University for 1924. Or they're going to say something like, we have city directories or church directories for the Methodist Episcopal Church for 1899, but they're not going to give you the names of the people who are in it. So what you need to do and what you need to recommend to your patrons is that when they're preparing to go to an archive or they're preparing to go to a museum, that they need to have more than just, I'm looking for the Smith family. They need to know what types of records they're looking for. They need to know the locations. They need to know what their denomination was. You know, were they Baptist? Were they Methodist? Did they go to school? Did they work as an apprentice for a blacksmith? Because that's how the records are going to be located. They're going to be located by Methodist Church, or they're going to be located by blacksmithing, or by subject heading, not necessarily by surname. So when you're in a museum, you know, you have to think more globally. And us as librarians, you know, as library staff, we're pretty much trained to think in multiple subject headings. So while I might look in the card catalog and I might know that the historical subject heading for cooking is cookery, very few people are going to know that. So they need to be encouraged to look for all of the ways that they can say the same thing. Are they looking for a cemetery? So are they looking for a cemetery or a graveyard, or, you know, a kirkyard, which is a church yard, you know, a cemetery? How many different ways can you say that? How many different ways can you say headstone, you know, grave marker, headstone? There's all these different terms that they should be thinking of before they go to an archive or to a museum, because not everything is going to be tagged in layman's terms, so to speak. You know, sometimes they're going to use very specific labels and headings, which might make no sense to us or to the genealogist. So the more words and the more terms and the more types of records that they can be looking for, the better off they are going to be in the long run. Whenever I go to a historical society or whenever I go to an archive or a museum, I always ask to see their unidentified photos. And they look at me like I've absolutely lost my mind. Like, why would you want to see photos where we have absolutely no idea who that person is? Well, because as a genealogist or a historian or a librarian, for those of us who are going to be helping these patrons, you know, that patron might have a picture of their ancestor, and that ancestor might be in a group photo, like a church Sunday school class, or they were a member of the American Legion, or there's a high school yearbook photo that just lists the graduating class of 1912. they might be able to identify that person in that photo, and not only are they helping themselves out by finding a new photo of their ancestor, but they're also helping out the archives or the historical society or museum, because now they're providing them with a name that they didn't have before. So I always encourage my patrons to always ask to see the unidentified photos, especially group photos, because they just might be able to find that person that they're looking for. They just didn't know because the image wasn't cataloged down to that level. So Archive Grid is WorldCat for archives. So if any of you have ever used Archive Grid, it is very similar to WorldCat, and it runs on the WorldCat platform. And what Archive Grid does is it allows you to go in and search these special collections and these archives. So I have a friend who's writing a book on the history of vaudeville in Chicago. So he was looking for a very specific vaudeville actor who had been in the Chicagoland area about the time of the First World War. So I was able to go into Archive Grid and start doing some searches on vaudeville, on vaudevillians, on actors, and all the terms that I knew. And I was able to find 3 collections in Illinois on vaudeville that were at either an archives in the Chicagoland area or at a university where he could then contact them and ask for copies of these records. So it drills into that collection like I was saying, but you can't expect to put in George Burns, who was an early vaudeville actor, and expects to come up with a lot of individual records. You have to just search on the terms and the types of records. For those of us in Illinois, we have access to the Illinois Association of Museums. So there are lots of small societies and museum collections that are in the illinoismuseums.org website. So you can find things like the Perry County Genealogical Society. You can find things like the Plainfield Historical Society, the Little White School Museum. All kinds of these small homegrown organizations are within this website, so it makes it easy for you to contact them or direct your patrons to contact them for more information. The downside to some of these small museums is that they don't have a web presence. There's not a dedicated website. So if a patron just does a Google search on Plainfield Historical Society, they're not going to come up with anything because they don't have a website that Google is going to ping against. So the Illinois Museum's website is great for giving street addresses and phone numbers and hours of operation sometimes for these organizations that don't have a web presence. In your chat box, how many of you have used the Illinois State Archives system, whether the State Archives in Springfield or one of the IRAD depositories across the state of Illinois? And you guys can just say yes or no if you have. But the Illinois State Archives has the State Archives, which is in Springfield, but then they also have a series of regional archives scattered across the state of Illinois. Now, unfortunately, they are not like Wisconsin. Wisconsin allows their materials to move from one branch to another if they need to be made available to a patron. The state of Illinois doesn't do that. So if you need records for Anna, Illinois, you have to go to Southern Illinois University in order to access them. But what the state archives collects is they collect things on state government. So whether you have an ancestor who was a state senator or whether you have an ancestor who just worked for the state of Illinois, maybe in one of the DMV offices, they're going to have those types of records. They're going to have land records. So if you bought federal land from the government, a copy of those would often get filed at the state archives as well. Military service records, so things like Civil War unit records are available through the Illinois State Archives. That branch of the government was called the Adjutant General. So the Adjutant General's office is still in existence. It's part of the Illinois National Guard. So anything from World War I to the present, if they served in the Illinois National Guard, would be in Springfield, but they would be in the Adjutant General's office through the National Guard office. If they served before the First World War, from the Civil War up to the Spanish-American War, those records are at the state archives. So if you had an ancestor who served in a Civil War unit from the state of Illinois, they were in the 1st Illinois Artillery, or they were in the 100th Illinois Wow, that word just completely left me. I apologize. Infantry, if they were in the 1st Illinois Infantry, then those records on the unit are going to be at the state archives. And what those include are the muster rolls. So everybody who's coming in and then being discharged from a particular unit. They would also have things like after action reports and monthly reports. So if they saw a battle, if they were at the Battle of Shiloh, they would then write up a report saying we had 3 men wounded, we lost 4 horses, and 2 cannons were destroyed. So they keep all of these reports based on what's going on within the unit, and then they file those at the state archives. So those are accessible to your patrons as well. You can send the Illinois State Archives an email. They have a link on their website where you can contact them for copies of records. So you have access to the land records, you have access to the military service records just by emailing them. Some other fun things that they have is they have penitentiary records. So if you had somebody who was, sent downstate to Dwight, or if they were sent to prison at Joliet, they've been digitizing those, and they're actually available online right now through IDA Illinois. I mentioned IDA Illinois in my previous 2 webinars that I've done. It's just IDA for Illinois Digital Archives, idaillinois.org. And the State Archives has a collection within there, and these penitentiary records are in there. They're kind of cool. So for Joliet Prison, they go back to 1853. So I can see all of the people who are being thrown in jail and why. So just some fun things that are there. They also have vital records. They have marriages and deaths that are available to the public on microfilm. You can also request these through the state library, through the State Archives website as well. There's the link, and I give the link to you down here at the bottom. But I want to walk you through a couple of slides so you can get a feel for the types of things that they have. Now, the Illinois State Archives, they'll provide genealogical help to you as best as they can. They have, at the bottom, you see there's a link on their website for genealogical research. When you click on that link, it takes you to a series of pamphlets that they've done. And I attached one in your the email that Louise sent to you that shows you the types of things. I think I sent you land records. So it shows you the type of land records that you can access through the State Archives. They have one on military records. They have one on a variety of topics. They're anywhere from 6 to 8 pages long. And you can download the pamphlet and hand it to your patron. Or you can give your patrons the link, and then they can access the pamphlets and download them themselves straight through the Secretary of State's website. So for those of you who didn't know, Jesse White is not only our Secretary of State, he is our state archivist, and he is our state librarian, which is why the State Archives website and the State Library's website fall under CyberDrive Illinois, is because he is the head of all 3 of those bodies. So beyond looking at the genealogy pamphlets, you can view their state holdings by going to what they call Archon, which is their online catalog. So if you click on that link that I've provided for you here, you can start searching for the types of records that the State Archives has within its collections, things like school records, or in this case, what I was looking for were mental health records. So mental health is one of those types of categories that are really, really hard to research, no matter what state you're doing the research. So the state of Illinois, at the State Archives, has collections that have been turned over from mental health facilities, the follow-up to, the asylums that they used to be called. So you can see that they have things here. I did a search for Elgin. So for the Elgin State Mental Hospital, you can see all of the different collections here that they have. And I just did a snapshot of part of this collection because the rest of it wouldn't fit on the screen. But it shows you that they have things like the Poor Farm, the farm accounts books from 1872 to 1877, or their medical case books. Sadly, they only have 1 year. They don't know where the rest of them went. But if you come across in a census record, a patron comes up and says, I have an ancestor who's listed in the 1880 census as being at Chicago State Mental Hospital, or the Kankakee Asylum, then you can direct them to the State of Illinois Archives page, and then they can start to do the research on the records themselves. So I clicked on one of them. So what they do is they give you the ID so that you can go to the State Archives and collect the information. It tells me that this is just a 1-volume book that they have, but it tells me what's included, not by name. Like I said, they're not drilling down deep enough for that, but they're telling me what is roughly included. So it's telling me the person's name, where they're born, what their occupation is, what type of commitment it was, when they were committed, and then what was the cause of the insanity, which is kind of interesting. Is it alcoholism? Is it postpartum depression? What is causing them to have to be committed? So there's some really hard to find information out there. The state doesn't do a great job of broadcasting this kind of information because they don't want to make it easy for people, because they don't want to be inundated by people who are looking for this type of sensitive information. But you can go into the search box like you see up in the upper left-hand corner and do a search on whatever the topic is, whether it's Jackson County one-room schools, or whether it's Adjutant General's records for Vermilion County, and just see what's available. So like I mentioned, the Illinois State Archives has what are called the Regional Archives Depositories. And what that means is that there are 7 university libraries scattered throughout the state of Illinois who house the government records for those surrounding counties. So you kind of see in this little snapshot image that NEIU, which is Northeastern Illinois University, only has records for Cook County. It only has records for Cook County. That does not include the city of Chicago. So births, marriages, and deaths for Cook County are included, but births, marriages, and deaths for the city of Chicago are not. The city of Chicago kept their own records and did not turn them over to the county as requested. So unfortunately, when you're dealing with the city of Chicago, you still have to go through David Orr's office, the county clerk. But what they do have at NEIU are things like Cook County voters records. They have records for Cook County Hospital. They have the admissions books up to the 1940s for Cook County Hospital. So if you had somebody who caught the flu in 1918 or gave birth to their child in 1932, those admissions books would have that information. And it's really sweet to see the births, because you see the mother checking in and then you see the mother and the child checking out, and they give you the name of the child. So in some instances when there's no birth record because it's before 1914 when they started enforcing it, sometimes this is the only way you're going to find out that this child was born. So there's some really neat things that they have. Like ISU would collect things for McLean County and Logan County. What's neat about the IRAD system is that they will copy records for you for up to 2 names per request. So you can't have your patron contact them and say, give me everything on the Smiths, in Union County. They're not going to do that. But if you say, I would like information on John and Anna Smith from Union County, then they'll do a search for you. The first 2 pages are free. So any 2 copies they make, the first 2 will be free. And then it's only 50 cents after that. So if they don't need a certified copy from the county, let's say, Cook County charges $16 or Will County charges $11. If they don't need it to be certified, get a copy of it from the state IRAD system, and it would only be 50 cents. So down at the bottom, you have the link to get to the IRAD list, to get to this map that you see here. And then once you click on that link, then it shows you each of the IRADs and the counties in which they collect. So for ISU, it tells me that they have DeWitt, Ford, Grundy, Iroquois, Kankakee, Livingston. You see all of the different counties that they collect the records at the regional archives at ISU. So some of them are actually at the libraries at the universities, which is the case at Northern Illinois University, Southern Illinois University, NEIU. They're actually in the library at the university. ISU's is actually off campus. It's by where the old graduate school housing used to be, by the golf course. So it's a little ways away from ISU proper, as you can see on Warehouse Road. So they're not always right on campus. So you want to make sure your patron knows that before they go. You can call them and you can write them a letter, but you cannot email them. So the patron's not going to get an online, quick answer. Like I said, these are records that are offline. These are records that they have to kind of do the digging away from the computer. But when you click on one of these, so let's say, we clicked on Grundy County, then it would tell us the types of information that they have on the county. So this is just a snapshot of the top of the page. It tells me the county information. It tells me the phone number for the county clerk, the recorder, the circuit clerk, what their address is. But then if you keep going, it's just a very brief fact sheet about the history of the county. It's going to show you the townships within the county. It's going to tell you when it was established. But it's not going to give you the records that the IRAD has. That is another link. So if you click on the name of the county, all you're going to be provided is the fact sheet like you see here. But I'm going to talk about township records. If we don't run out of time in my case study, I want to talk about townships, because townships are the smallest unit of government in the state of Illinois for the most part. And township records are separate from county records. So they're not often housed at the county seat. So if a county courthouse has a fire, township records a lot of times will still manage to survive because they're not in that same building. And I'm going to give you an example of that at the end. So how do you find the information that the IRAD has? At the top of the page, let me go back a couple. At the top of the page where you're looking at the map, there's a link that says Local Government Records Database. If you click on that, that's when you can do your search by county. So if you want to know what they have, like this does for Hancock County or for Tazewell County, you can then search for that county. Leave the title blank because you just want the patron to see everything that they have from within that county, and then let them decide what's most pertinent to them. So what Hancock County has is they have adoption records all the way up to 1904. They have burial and removal permits. So if a body is transferred from Hancock County to Union County, then there's a record of that burial transfer, which is not always easy to find. And then they have their standard birth records, marriage records, death records. But these are two pretty unique collections that not all counties have. So if you're recommending that a patron go to the IRAD system and take a look at what the county has, it is not one-stop shopping. If they see adoption records listed available for Hancock County, that does not mean that those adoption records are going to be available in any other county. There are lots of counties who have these one-off collections that nobody else has. Vermilion County is one as well because they have World War I bonuses that the county itself gave out to its veterans separate from the state. There's no other county in Illinois that has that. So out of the 104 counties within the state of Illinois, that's a lot of different researching that your patron has the opportunity to utilize. So now the federal archive. So there's a difference between what the state collects and what the federal government collects. So the federal government is interested in things like immigration and naturalization records. So that would include things from ships manifests all the way to citizenship papers. They're going to have the sale of government lands. So as the U.S. began moving westward, you had a series of land sales that the government provided to individuals, whether it was because they served in the Revolutionary War and they were given a land grant, or they were a homesteader in 1862 and they were given a land grant. The National Archives keeps track of all of that paperwork, and it's available at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. What they also have are military records at Washington, D.C. that cover the Revolutionary War to 1914, so just before World War I. So what that includes is both the personnel records, so if they had an ancestor who served in the War of 1812 or the Civil War, those personal files are going to be there. But it also means that their unit records are going to be there as well. So the state kept track of their soldiers with a different set of paperwork than what the federal records collected. So there's two sets of records that your patron can access. There's also what's called Archives 2, which is a separate building off of the University of Maryland in College Park. And they collect things like maps and prints and photographs. They have an extensive prints and photographs division. They also collect video recordings and audio recordings, as well as military records just for units and bases. They do not have personnel records from World War I to Vietnam. So if I was looking for somebody who served in the Air Corps, and they were in an aero group or an aero unit, then I can look up that unit here at Archives 2. But if I wanted the individual servicemen's records, I would have to go to St. Louis, which is here. So the National Personnel Records Center, Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, keeps track of more than just military service records. So if you have a patron who says, you know, I would really like to get a copy of my dad's military record, you know, he served in the Navy in World War II, this is who they would contact. So they would contact the NPRC in St. Louis, and they would be allowed to request a copy of that service record. So if they are next of kin, which you see at the bottom, next of kin includes unremarried widow. So if the widow, if she remarries, then she is no longer next of kin and she does not have access to these records. A child, a sibling, or a parent does, not a grandchild, not a cousin, not a nephew. In order to get these records from NPRC for free, you have to be next of kin. So your patron needs to know that they need to fall into one of those categories in order to be eligible for free copies. You can request them at a cost. There's a difference, though. If you're next of kin, you're going to get a fuller file than if you're just requesting as a relative or somebody who's just doing research. So that's something that you need to keep in mind for them. So they also have government employee records. So if you had, or if they had a relative who was in the Forest Service or was a Postmaster General, they're going to have those records in St. Louis. My grandmother, during the Second World War, worked in Army purchasing at Navy Pier in Chicago. And they had a 100+ page file of her as a government employee working in Army purchasing. So it had things like her typing exams and the survey that she would have to fill out in order to become an employee of the government. So some really cool things were found within there. Civilian Conservation Corps, for any of you who are history buffs, the CCC was started in the 1930s by President Roosevelt. And the Civilian Conservation Corps were groups of young men who were sent out to do manual labor, to repair things like bridges and dams, and to actually build roads and create bridges and take care of all of this infrastructure across the United States. So if somebody says, I have a relative who served in the CCC, then their personnel record of them being a member of the Conservation Corps would be in St. Louis. The records about what they did, if they were building bridges in Seattle or if they were building roads in Michigan, those would be at one of the regional archives, and I'll talk about those in a second. So the National Archives is open to the public, whether you go to Archives 1 or 2, whether you go to St. Louis, or whether you go to a regional branch. Those are open to the public. If you want to look at records, you need to contact them a minimum of 8 weeks in advance, because the archive has to pull the records for you and make sure that they have them before you come down. So both in DC, you have to make an appointment, and at the National Archives in St. Louis, you need to make an appointment because they need to make sure that they have the file ready for you before you come down. They will not give you a date, and they will not give you a seat number until they have found all of the documents your patron has requested or you've requested. Then they'll let you set up a date, but they will not let you say, I'm coming down March 1st. They will tell you when you're coming down, unfortunately. So any record that was created before the 1st of January 1954 is open to the public. You do not have to be next of kin. You just make your appointment, you tell them what you're looking for, and you can go down and view them. If it's after 1954, January 1st, 1954, then yes, you have to be next of kin. So the National Archives has 16 regional archives across the U.S., from Alaska to Georgia. They also are responsible for 15 presidential libraries. They're responsible for 15 additional affiliated archives. So those are branches that they have that are not open to the public. There's 2 in Kansas City. There's 1 in Cincinnati. They're kind of scattered around the country. But each one collects records for their surrounding states. So our National Archives branch here in Chicago is called the Great Lakes branch of the National Archives, and they collect records for Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, and Wisconsin. They do not collect for Iowa or Missouri or Kansas or Nebraska. Those are in Kansas City. So what do they have? They have those federalized naturalization records that I was talking about after 1920. They have FBI case files, which are fascinating. So if any of you have mobster connections or you have patrons who had family that ran with Al Capone, they have the FBI case files, and they also have the FBI mugshot books where you can go and look at the individual photos of the criminals in these great big mug books. They also kept track of things like copyright and trademark violations. So, you know, when people sue Disney or when people sue, you know, Post cereal, they keep records of those. They have 4 out of 5 of the Great Lakes maritime records. So if a ship goes down in Lake Michigan or if a ship goes down in, you know, Lake Erie, they're going to have copies of those types of records. But what's also interesting is they have the Bureau of Indian Affairs records. So in Illinois, Indian Affairs doesn't really mean much to us, but if you have family who was in Michigan or you have family who was in Minnesota, then the Bureau of Indian Affairs records could have some great stuff for you. So that's enough about archives. Now remember when you're dealing with archives that these are things that are not going to be cataloged down to the individual level. So if you're looking for a military service record, you need to know the branch of service and the unit that they served in at the very least in order to access these records. If they were a postmaster, then you need to at least have the state and the rough regional area. You know, if you don't know the specific county, you need to have a general idea of where they were in the state of Illinois to be able to drill into those records. But they're not done John Smith, you know, William Johnson. They're not done to that level. Same thing with local historical societies and genealogical societies. This is probably the best avenue of research when you're dealing with your patrons because that's where you're going to find a lot of that really fun family history. So if they owned a local business, if they were a fishmonger, or if they were a grocery store owner, they could have donated their books to the local historical society or genealogical society. Things like directories, whether it's a city directory or phone books, whether it's a church directory, like a Catholic Church Jubilee book or an anniversary book for the Methodist Church. They're going to have school directories, you know, alumni directories for schools. They're going to have school photos, school yearbooks. So they're going to have a lot of that type of individual family history. So family diaries, papers, records. Now, when you're dealing with these types of records, like I said, they're not drilled down to the individual surname. So, you know, when you go to a genealogical society or a historical society, you need to be very broad, and your patrons need to be very broad in what they're researching. Because if you go in and you say, I'm looking for information on John Smith, is there a family diary? Well, there might not be. But John Smith could be mentioned in the family diary of, you know, the Jones family because they live next door. They're not reading these diaries and writing down the names page for page. So sometimes you need to just be generic in your request and say, do you have diaries? Do you have church directories? Do you have school photos? And start doing that digging from there. Things like group records. Were they a member of the American Legion? Were they a member of the local Masonic Lodge? Were they a member of the Knights of Pythias or Knights of Columbus? Were they in a service organization like Lions Club or Rotary International? Those group records, those newspaper articles where they mention those groups, you know, the anniversaries and the picnics and the events that those groups would hold, a lot of times you can find those at a local genealogical or historical society. Military service papers, the soldiers being discharged, he passes away, his family donates his uniform and his papers to the local society. And a lot of them have extensive newspaper clippings files. So not just about obits. It could be about a famous park that you might have within your community, or you know, an influential college, or it could be an influential leader that you had that they've collected these newspaper clippings over the years. The downside to, like I said, to historical and genealogical societies is the fact that the vast majority of this is not online and it is not indexed, because historical societies and genealogical societies are run by volunteers. And volunteers need to have the time and they need to have the skill and the resources in order to make these collections accessible. So, you know, the best of intentions is that they've collected it, but they don't have the opportunity to then put this stuff online or to really index it and drill into it and provide the information that you're seeking. So a lot of times if you're going to recommend that a patron contact a local historical or genealogical society, you want to tell them that this is not going to be a short visit. It is not going to be a one and done type of scenario. It's the kind of thing where they want to build up a good genealogical rapport because they're probably going to have to be going back to this group again and again and again as they discover new names or as they discover new research. I have the director of Little White School Museum. I am one of the board directors, and Roger is famous for saying, you know, you prime the pump. If I'm going to go to a genealogical society to ask them for their information, then I take something with me. If it's a family photo or an album or a military service record, I take something with me and I give it to them to add to their collection. So it's not just what can you give me, it's what can your patron provide them. So you get a lot more information and you build a much stronger relationship when the information goes both ways. So you might want to encourage your patrons to start participating and sharing what they have as a way of building that bridge to gleaning out what the local society has. There are some really cool Facebook and Flickr pages that are out there for historical and genealogical societies. So for those societies that just don't have the skill to put together a website, a lot of them will put some collections up on Flickr or up on Facebook. So, you know, that's an avenue of research that your patrons should be taking advantage of. So things like the Chicago Genealogical Society has a very active Facebook page. Will Grundy Genealogical Society, again, Little White School Museum, which I am a member of, you know, they'll post any new programs that are coming up, new collections that have been donated, you know, new tidbits in genealogy or historical research that's happening. So it's a very quick way to find out what's going on within those communities. Are they closed because of a power outage? You know, are they closing for 2 months for remodeling? Are they closing over the winter so that they can revamp and change exhibits? So checking to see if there's a Facebook page is a really good place to start, because then your patron can, again, start building that rapport. They can send them a message, they can share information they have. And then Flikr, by all means, the National Archives, Library of Congress, National Genealogical Society, Illinois State Genealogical Society are on Flikr. The Florida Memory Project, the Virginia Memory Project. So there are a lot of state institutions, a lot of national institutions, a lot of local libraries and genealogical societies that are using Flikr to connect with people outside of the genealogy world. Somebody who might just have a son or daughter who's doing a project on old bridges or 19th century hats, and they're going to go to someplace like Flikr to look for that kind of data. So as long as I'm talking about online resources, I have to put in a plug for Try It Illinois, because Try It Illinois just went live on October 1st, even though passwords didn't go out until last Monday. So if you have a patron or us as librarians, we should be going in and utilizing Try It Illinois between now and November 30th. There's all kinds of genealogical websites in there. You've got ProQuest, you've got Newspaper Archive, you've got Fold3, you've got Historic MapWorks. So you have a lot of genealogy websites that you can recommend to your patrons. Not all of them go through November 30th. I know ProQuest have a tendency to end November 15th, so you might want to have your patron be sure that what the collection end date is. But this is the 2016 password, so if you have not already gotten it from the State Library, IL Free Try is the login, and ILLINET16 is the password, and then go in and play. Just have a good time. It's the one time a year I have access to the entire United States historic Sanborn maps. So, you know, usually we can only get what's within the state. So it's nice to see and have access to things across the country. So the next couple of slides are just the types of Illinois resources. I know I wasn't going to focus online, but I want you to have these as a reference point. A lot of these are referred to in one of the handouts Louise emailed you when I did my webinar in February. I did a webinar on free resources for the state of Illinois, free resources for genealogy, both in the state of Illinois and in the U.S. and globally. So download that handout. You'll see several of these listed in here. But everything from Illinois Digital Archives, which I mentioned is where the penitentiary intake books are, to Kane County Vital Records, you know, Aurora, St. Charles, Hampshire, all of these are included within Kane County's Vital Records. In the Chicagoland area, you have access to Chicago Ancestors, which is done by the Newberry Library. Chicago Public Library has put together several collections that are available for those doing research in Cook County. So you have a lot of these resources that are in that handout section on the website. So please go in and take a look at these after the fact. Stephen Morse and Linkpendium are two I recommend just because they are really good at drilling into collections online to help you find exactly what your patron's looking for. Some state and national websites, Daughters of the American Revolution, has a really, really good website, which I mentioned before, about finding ancestors and descendants of Revolutionary War patriots. If you missed that, you can refer to the webinar from a couple of weeks ago. And then just some really great states who get it right. Missouri State Archives, Washington State Archives. I already gave you the Illinois State Archives, Minnesota Historical Society. So there's some good resources out there. So now I'm going to do a couple of case studies. Angus, my darling Angus. Look at how beautiful he was. So Angus has been my white whale. Him and his cousin have been my white whale for the past 7 years. I have been on the hunt for Angus's military records since 2009. It's been a really long time. So Angus's eldest daughter, Marion, came to me because she wanted to know more about her dad's military service. She had known that he had served in the First World War. When I met her, she was 86 years old. She was one of 4 kids, and you know, all her life she had called her dad Sarge. Never called him Dad. You know, family didn't call him Angus. He was always called Sarge by everybody who knew him. So that's really all she knew. Well, he must have been a sergeant because everybody called him Sarge. On his military headstone, it listed the unit that he had served in the First World War. And as you see here, Marion had a photo of him in his uniform. He was so handsome. So we started online. We started with what ancestry might have available. So in the 1920 census, he's listed as a veteran, that he was a veteran of the First World War. They also had a World War I draft card for him that listed him as living in Galesburg, Illinois. After a little bit of digging, we figured out why he was in Galesburg, because on his draft card it says that he was working for the railroad. So he was working for the railroad that stopped between Aurora and Galesburg, which is why he was there the date of the draft. On his U.S. headstone application for his military headstone, his wife Clara filled out the application after he died, and that was also accessible on Ancestry. So in the 1920 census, he's living in South Carolina, which was a bit of a stretch to find, and it was hard to locate because he's listed as A.L. McDonald. He's not listed as Angus. What we found when we were looking for records for McDonald is the fact that in this case and in the state website case, they spaced McDonald. So it was MC space D-O-N-A-L-D. It wasn't all together. So when you have a patron who's doing research, if they are a, McLean, or if they are a, D'Angelo, make sure that they're spelling it with the space and without the space, because the state archives website, when you go into their databases, typically put that space in. So it's something to be aware of when somebody keeps coming up blank, that if there's a name that could have a space or a hyphen, that they put that gap in. So it tells me he's a boarder, he's 23 years old. What's interesting about it is because he's a boarder, he's listed as being born in South Carolina, because the head of the rental unit in which he was living didn't know that he wasn't a native. So it took us a while to find this record because it should have said that he was born in the state of Illinois. And here it doesn't. It just says that everybody in that rental unit is born and raised in South Carolina. But what it does tell me in this little triangle is W, that he served in the First World War. So after a long time of digging, we were finally able to find him in the 1920 census to verify that, yes, he was a veteran. That application for headstone or marker, it's two-sided. I just printed out the first side for you. But when you have a patron who's looking at records online, always have them click the arrow to go back an image and forward an image, because sometimes they're scanning fronts and backs of documents, especially if they're looking at ship's manifests or if they're looking at naturalization records. Those are two-page documents, so you want to make sure that they're seeing both pages to the document that they're looking at. But it tells me that he's in the 45th Artillery Coastal Artillery Corps. Gives me his enlistment date, gives me his discharge date, but it doesn't tell me where. It doesn't tell me where he enlisted, and it doesn't tell me where he was discharged. So those were all additional information that we needed to try to find. It tells me that he is a sergeant, so it did confirm the nickname Sarge that he had received, and that he was in charge of the supply company for the Artillery Corps. So what did I do next? I started with my public library. We have no index to our local newspaper, so I had to go through each and every issue manually on the microfilm reader during the First World War years to try to find references to Angus. Now you understand why this took me 7 years. So I had to go through all of those newspapers one at a time as time permitted. So I found a letter to the editor telling me that he was based at Fort Screven in Georgia in 1918. And then in March of 1919, I found a welcome home announcement saying that there was a dinner that was being given for returning soldiers, but that Angus could not attend because he had just been discharged and hadn't actually arrived back in Joliet yet. So here's a copy. These are portions of Angus's article, the letter to the editor that he wrote. So it tells me that he's at Fort Screven, Georgia, and then he says, thanks, as a Plainfield boy, I'm so grateful that you sent me the newspapers, and goes on to describe what life is like in the Coastal Artillery Corps. What's fascinating, though, is when U.S.C. Blakely, who was the editor for the Enterprise, transcribed the letter into newsprint, he misspelled his name. He had him listed as August L. McDonald instead of Angus L. McDonald. So again, that was another piece of information that if I had been looking in an online database and I'd put in Angus, I would have never have found him. So I got lucky that I knew exactly who I was looking for. So I knew that that's a typo by the editor, not that Angus miswrote his own name. So I know that he had returned back to Joliet for a short time before he went to South Carolina. So the county recorder of deeds in every county in Illinois is responsible for handling and recording military discharges by returning soldiers as they come in chronologically. So if all 20 of us get in line to file our discharge papers at the county, they're going to put them in the order in which we're standing in line, not necessarily alphabetical. So the indexes to these records are accessible to the public. The actual records themselves are not, because the state of Illinois a couple of years ago passed a law saying that military discharges are only available to the soldier who served. That doesn't help us when you have a World War I vet who's no longer alive, or a World War II, or a Spanish-American War veteran who's no longer alive. So it took us 8 months with a lot of back and forth between the county VA and the county recorder of deeds office until we could finally get a copy of Angus's discharge paper. I had found him in the index. I went through all of the dates for 1919 because I know that he was discharged according to Clara's certificate in February of 1919. So I went through the index and looked at every record that was recorded by the recorder from February, March, and April of 1919. So whether or not somebody was filing a mechanic's lien or a mortgage or a military discharge, I had to sort through all of those until I found him in the record. He told me that he was in book 539 on page 75, and finally I was able to procure a copy of that. So it tells me how tall he is, tells me what his occupation was, that he was a brakeman for the railroad, he had blue eyes, and then it tells me that he had excellent character, he had never gone missing, he was never AWOL, but it says that he was released in good health. Well, the story Marion had heard on the family was that he had been gassed while he was in France. So she was really looking to find out, is this true? Because when he came home from the war, he was never the same. He had stomach ailments, stomach cancer, he had issues with his stomach the rest of his life until he died at 58 years old. So here it says that he was discharged in good health, which doesn't substantiate the story that he had been gassed. So I went to St. Louis. So I drove down to St. Louis to request Angus's personnel file to see exactly what had happened to him while he was in the service. Well, sadly, it was only 3 pages long. It gave me his final payment voucher, it gave me a copy of the index card showing the unit in which he served, and then it had one piece of paper that said that he had been in the hospital, but not for what. So what it means to be a fire record is that at the National Archives in the 1970s, they had a massive fire, and that fire destroyed over 8 million service files. Now think of it this way. Every service file could have anywhere from, 15 to 75 pages in it, if not more. So 8 million records, we're talking millions and millions and millions of pages of records were destroyed by the fire. And Angus's, of course, happened to be one of those, because Angus could not be easy. So With that being a fire record, the National Archives had no information on his personal military service other than just the verification that, yes, he had served. We know that he was discharged from Camp Grant. This final payment voucher confirms what we received from the county saying that he was discharged at Camp Grant. So then I decided I was going to go to Kansas City. We'll come back to that in a minute. Kansas City led me to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The National Archives, too, in College Park handles, like I said, all of those military records pertaining to units and bases. So the military base records, so for Camp Grant, for Fort Screven, would be at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The unit records were at National Archives 2 in College Park. So after searching through all of the 45th Coastal Artillery Supply Brigade records that they had, I was able to find 4 documents that had Angus's name listed on it. The one you see here, which shows him as, you know, the sergeant of the unit, along with the men under his command, his promotion to supply sergeant, and then his promotion to sergeant. So I had the best information on him that I had had in the 7 years I've been researching. Sadly, I found it 2 months after Marion passed away. She passed away in February. But her sister was very happy to have it. So they did list where they were stationed in France. So I do know what hospital, if Angus had been gassed, what hospital he would have been sent to in France. All of those records are in Kansas City. So my next stop this spring is going to be Kansas City to go through hospital records to see if I can verify whether or not Angus was truly gassed. So the state of Illinois has, within their state archives, the applications for bonuses for soldiers who returned home from World War I. So soldiers who returned were entitled to a bonus based on the number of days in which they served in the military. So in Angus's case, you know, he served for a little over a year, so his bonus would be based on, you know, 400 days of military service. So Angus is listed in the index for soldiers. I was able to find him in that card file, which you see here. But once again, there was a fire at the State Adjutant General's records in 1936, and 80% of those applications were destroyed. And you guessed it, Angus's was one of the files that did not survive. So once again, you know, Angus has just found every reason to not be accessible. But what's fascinating about the index card file is that he applied for his bonus not when he returned home from the war, but after he had already moved to South Carolina. So what it tells me in the index is that I need to see if he applied for a bonus in South Carolina as well to see if then I can find some additional information on him. So I am not through with Angus, not even close am I through with Angus, but at least it's a start. So now about busting those brick walls. I talked about courthouses. What do you do if there's a courthouse fire? I had a woman come into the library just last week, actually, and she's trying to become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And in order to become a member, you need to be able to show a clean descendancy from the patriot who served to yourself. It has to be a direct line. It cannot be a collateral line. It cannot be a cousin or an uncle or a nephew. It has to be a direct line. Well, she came to me and she says, you come in very high regard. She says, I want to show you a Bible page. And I'm not going to tell you what it is first, but I want you to look at it and tell me what you think. Okay, challenge accepted. I'll take a look at this document. So she pulls out this Bible page, and across the top it says marriages. And in the left-hand column, starting in 1857, there are a series of marriages listed, all in different handwritings, for the descendants of this patriot. The first column on the left gets full, and then they start writing in the right-hand column. Well, at the top of the right-hand column, written in very neat, beautiful handwriting, says that this ancestor that she's looking for married his wife in the state of Kentucky, in Scott County, but there's no date given. And the information that's written down is not dated. And then right below it, you see the continuation of all of the marriages listed in chronological order. So I told her, I said, well, I'm very sorry, but I don't think that this record was done in the 1850s. I said, I think it was done after the fact because they didn't write like that in 1850, and it's not an ink that they would have used in 1850. So she was very upset that I wouldn't verify her conclusion. That in fact, as it turns out, I apparently agreed with the DAR registrar in Washington, D.C., who rejected it for that same reason. So she says, well, this is the only piece of information that I have verifying that this person came from Virginia to Scott County, Kentucky. I don't know what to do. Where do I go from here? So sadly for her, Scott County Courthouse burned. Not one time, not two times, but 3 times in the last 150 years. Scott County Courthouse has been destroyed. And then on top of that, there was a tornado in 2008 that wiped out the entire town, including the church. So the town doesn't exist anymore. It has been wiped off the map. So she can't become a member of the DAR because there's no other record that shows this marriage or this family in Kentucky after 1820. So her suggestion was, well, what do I do? So here are some suggestions that I gave her. So sometimes the surrounding county courthouses will have duplicates of records. So if this particular gentleman owned land in Scott County, but he also owned land in the county next door or in the county over, then when you die in your probate, if you're a landholder, then you needed to file a copy of that probate in every county in which you owned land. So it's very possible that even though Scott County had a fire and the record was destroyed, if he owned land in the next county, then that copy of that probate and that land purchase are going to be safe and sound in the county courthouse in that county, assuming they did not have a fire either. The Kentucky State Archives is another possible place to look because if they arrived in the 1820s, it was most likely under land that was given by the federal government. So she can look for a land patent, a sale to him from the federal government, and those would be kept at the state archives. The state library might have old newspapers on microfilm that she can use. Now, just because there isn't a newspaper in the community in which your patron is researching does not mean that they're not recorded in other places. So, for example, the earlier you go, the fewer newspapers that existed in a particular state or particular county. So, if in Kentucky in 1820 or 1830, there were only 2 newspapers, one was in Lexington and one was in Bowling Green, and they lived in Scott County, where are they going to run their advertisements? Where are they going to run their administrator's notices for their probate? They're going to run it in the paper that's there. So even if it's 50 miles away, even if it's 75 miles away, it's very possible that that death announcement or that marriage announcement might have shown up in a newspaper because it was the only newspaper in the state. Township records I alluded to earlier. Township records are usually not kept within the county courthouse. So the township would have things like highways commissioner's records, justice of the peace reports, personal property tax inventories. So even if the county courthouse is destroyed, she might still find his name listed in early highway commissioner reports because as a farm owner, you would have to pay in order to have a road put through to your farm. So you could get from your farm to the church or your farm to the grain silos or your farm to town. And you would have to agree to pay every year to have that road straightened and graded, get rid of all the potholes and fill all the low spots. So the early highway commissioner's records sometimes are the earliest records of settlers to a new county because they would be listed as subscribing to pay for the local school or the local road or the local bridge over the local creek. So township records are not online. They are not indexed. You have to go through them page by page chronologically as they're recorded. Same with Justice of the Peace. Justice of the Peace was responsible for handling those petty court claims. So your horses bust through the fence and they start eating your neighbor's alfalfa. Your neighbor sues you to repay him for the alfalfa that the horses ate. That would go through the Justice of the Peace in the township in which you live. So it's a great avenue of research for finding really, really early settlers' records. And they often include road maps. So they'll draw out where the road is supposed to go, and they'll mark the farms in the surrounding territories. So there's a lot of good data there. And then Internet Archives, which I gave you the link to a little bit earlier, for those early state histories or reminiscences. So you could do a search for the history of Scott County or the history of Kentucky or early settlers to Kentucky territory or Northwestern Territory, things like that. Here's my last one. Oh, we're still on time. So I had a patron come in to me. She had this photo of a baby girl in her family collection, and she had absolutely no idea who it was. So luckily, on the front and the back of the photo, there was a photographer's mark that listed who the photographer was and where their office was located. So all I had to do was go to the city directories for the city of Aurora and start looking for the studio at that address. The coolest thing about this image on the back was it said new ground floor studio. So all I had to do was go through the city directories to find out when Giles moved to its new studio at the corner of LaSalle and Benton Street. And luckily, that happened to be in 1899. So we know that that photo was taken most likely sometime between the fall of 1898, because city directories are done a year in arrears. So they collect the information through April and then put out the book in October. So the data is always slightly behind. It's always slightly dated. So he most likely moved into that space in 1898. So here's the front of Helen Lance's photo. So we know that the photo is taken in Aurora. So I started doing a search. She says, I can find no record of a Helen Lance. You know, I've looked in Ancestry, I've looked in Heritage Quest, I've looked online. I can find no mention of a Helen Lance in Aurora, in Kane County. So I did a search in Heritage Quest, and I left it very vague. I just put in Lance, no first name. We know that this baby's photo was taken sometime between 1898 and 1899, so I put a birth date in of 1898 and just hit search to see what happened. And about halfway down the page, you see Helen Lance, daughter of Isaac and Mary E. And they're in Wheatland in Will County. They're not even in Kane County. But Wheatland Township is right on the border to Kane County. And Aurora would have been the largest community for those farmers who lived in Wheatland Township. So it's not a stretch to assume that this is very possibly the same child that she couldn't find a record for. The 1900 census is brilliant because it is the only year that they asked for a specific month of birth. The rest of the time it was either how old are you going to be at your next birthday or how old are you? You could lie. You could say anything you wanted. But in this case, as they have written as Helen, daughter of Isaac and Mary, she is born January of 1899, and that she is 1 year old. You know, it tells me she's born in Illinois and her parents are from Germany and Pennsylvania. So do we have the same child? Not 100% sure if we have the same child, but it's a pretty good indication that we're dealing with the same family based on the geographic location, the age of the child, and the proximity to the studio from the farm. So those are all avenues of research to help find what you're looking for. So like I said, I was in an airplane mode, so just want to tell you, good luck, and we're all counting on you. So any questions? I'm happy to answer any questions.
Wow, thank you, Tina. That was a lot of information in just 90 minutes. I don't have any questions yet, but we have a few minutes. If people want to type those into the question box, we have time. I do want to comment back on the university and college collection. You know, I do a little genealogy research too, and I was impressed with what the University of Illinois at Chicago has in their special collections, as far as, like, I was looking for some information about church history, and they don't have the baptisms or, you know, marriages from the church, but they have the church books, the official business church books at their library, which was interesting. And you know, so you never know where you're going to find those gems that will help you with your research.
Don't let Louise fool you. She is an avid genealogist, and she is my genealogical counterpart. She is just as brilliant, not that I'm brilliant, but she is pretty good at what she does. But based on UIC's collection, they also have the building permits for the city of Chicago. So if you had an ancestor or a patron who had an ancestor that lived in the city of Chicago and ran a business, it's very possible that they're going to show up in those building permits that are available. There's an index online, but the original images are not online. Another one is Northwestern University has the Garrett Archives, the Garrett, what is it called? The Garrett Seminary School Archives. So if you have patrons who have, they're looking for Methodist preachers or they're looking for Methodist records, the Garrett Seminary archives are at Northwestern University also.
All right, well, I haven't received any questions, so I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up a few minutes early.
Is everybody just overwhelmed? I apologize. I warned you in advance. Thanks, though, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Tina, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.